Grab your Bibles, open to Daniel chapter 11, and while you're going there, let me remind you of where we've been. We've been in this series of messages for the past few weeks. Today is week number 10, and in this series of messages that we've called Into the Fire. Now, for those of you who managed today is your first time to be with us in the series, or maybe you're just a little unfamiliar with what our series is all about, basically what it means, the Into the Fire metaphor reminds us that every one of us comes face to face with these decisions that we have to make. And when we come face to face with these decisions, quite often one path leads towards God's will for our lives, and another path leads farther from God's will for our lives. And the crazy thing is that when we're standing at that decision point, standing at that moment of decision, and we look down the path that looks like it's God's will for our lives, we know it's God's will, the first destination on that path feels like hardship, feels like fire, feels like something painful and uncomfortable. And as we look down the path that leads us away from God's will for our lives, the first destination on that path looks like a place of comfort, looks like a place of ease. And so when you're in this decision-making moment and you see this first destination of fire versus ease, quite often we choose the comfortable path and get ourselves on a pathway that leads us farther away from God's will for our lives. But if we choose the path that looks like the fire path, we eventually discover that God meets us there, and He takes us through it, and on the other side of that, we experience blessing. And this is the way God works in our lives. We've seen it work in Daniel's life. For the first 6 chapters of Daniel, we see story after story of Daniel and his friends coming face to face with a decision that they had to choose whether they would pick the hard path that leads them into fire or the easy path. And every time they picked the hard path, and God blessed them for it. Now, we don't hear in Daniel any of the stories of Daniel making the mistakes, Daniel screwing up or his friends. But since he was alive for about 90 years, we're pretty sure he probably did. But that's neither here nor there for us right now, because the stories of the times when he successfully picked the path of the fire are inspiring enough for us. And hopefully you've been inspired and you've been encouraged by that as well. And that's really the overarching, the number one lesson we've been learning. This lesson that if we choose the fire, God meets us there and leads us to a place of blessing on the other side. But that's because of this underlying reason. There's another lesson that we've been learning, and that's a lesson that hopefully you've memorized by this point in time. It says, no matter what it looks like, God is in charge. No matter what it looks like, God is in charge. And that's the underlying lesson that allows us to say, I can go into the fire and God will meet me there and He will lead me to a place of blessing because I know He's in charge. And then just a couple weeks ago, we added one extra phrase to that. In Daniel chapter 9, he learned something new about this, not just that God was in charge, but also that God had a plan for His people. And so the full phrase works like this. No matter what it looks like, God is in charge and He has a plan for His people. Hopefully you're beginning to get some of that. Hopefully that's beginning to get a little bit internal to you. And when we came to Daniel 7, do you remember what happened then? In Daniel 7, everything changed. No longer did we have the cute stories. It wasn't Daniel in the lion's den, the story that you tell to your children with flannel graphs and videos. And Daniel, and oh, this was great. God saved him in the lion's den and because he was faithful and stuff. And it's no longer the fascinating story about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego going into this fiery furnace and God saving them there and rescuing them there. No, when you get to Daniel chapter 7, things get weird. Because in chapter 7, Daniel begins to get these visions from God, these revelations from God, crazy things of animals coming out of the sea, and they've got like 4 heads and 10 horns and 4 wings and all kinds of crazy stuff. And we've seen all that. And maybe you, like me, for the past few weeks, have been wishing, I just wish I had a little bit more detail. You know, because Daniel gets this crazy vision, then the angel comes and he gives an interpretation of that vision, but he doesn't give it all the interpretation. He just gives a little bit, just a few hints. And you, maybe like me, are in this place where you say, man, I just wish I had a little bit more detail. When it comes to Bible prophecy, I just want to know what it really means, you know, the extra details. I've got all kinds of questions. I'm kind of confused by this stuff. Well, I want to let you know that today you get what you asked for. Today, Daniel gets details. And in fact, these details are so detailed I'm begging you to try to pay attention to me as I read through chapter 11 and chapter 12. This is your challenge, to see how many of you can make it all the way through chapter 11 and chapter 12 with me, because these details, trust me, these are detailed. So anyway, let's get into it. Daniel chapter 11, beginning in verse 1, we're going to go all the way through, we pick it up in verse 2, going all the way through chapter 12, verse 4. Remember, these Bible verse divisions got made almost randomly sometimes, and so just because chapter 11 starts in verse 1 doesn't mean that the thought that we're trying to read starts in verse 1. So anyway, we're starting in verse 2. We're going all the way through chapter 12, verse 4. That's the one unit of thought, and it's on page 622 in the Bibles we passed out. This is a confusing history that Jesus is giving to Daniel. One last thing to remember. Last week, Daniel got this vision that he doesn't tell us about, and then he prays for 3 weeks, fasting and praying for 3 weeks, asking for God to give him some details, asking for God to give him an explanation. And then at the end of those 3 weeks, after he spent 3 weeks of not hearing anything, a glorious being shows up in front of Daniel. And last week, we have the benefit of knowing more than Daniel did. And we noticed that the description of the heavenly being that came to Daniel is exactly the same as the description of Jesus in the book of Revelation chapter 1. And so if Jesus intentionally wore all that garb, he was doing so to either look like the thing that visited Daniel or because he is the one who visited Daniel. And so we concluded last week that this is actually Jesus making an appearance 500 years before he was born to Daniel. Now, because he's God, he can do things before he was born, you know. That doesn't mean you ever did anything before you were born. Don't go there. But Jesus, 500 years before he was born to the Virgin Mary, he shows up to Daniel in his angelic, heavenly appearance. And it takes us a few 100 years before we see it again in the book of Revelation. So remember, these verses, these words that we're reading are coming from Jesus' mouth. They should be read in your Bible, but they're not, you know, because it's in the Old Testament and it's just the way it works. So anyway, these are coming from Jesus, okay? So let's pay attention to what Jesus has to say in response to Daniel's prayer for more details. Chapter 11, verse 2. Now then, I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and then a 4th who will be far richer than all the others. When he's gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king will arise, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. After he has arisen, his empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. The king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he and will rule his own kingdom with great power. After some years, they will become allies. The daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance, but she will not retain her power, and he and his power will not last. In those days, she will be betrayed together with her royal escort and her father and the one who supported her. One from her family line will arise to take her place. He will attack the forces of the king of the north and enter his fortress. He will fight against them and be victorious. He will also seize their gods, their metal images, and their valuable articles of silver and gold, and carry them off to Egypt. For some years he will leave the king of the north alone. Then the king of the north will invade the realm of the king of the south, but will retreat to his own country. His sons will prepare for war and assemble a great army, which will sweep on like an irresistible flood and carry the battle as far as his fortress. Then the king of the south will march out in a rage and fight against the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but it will be defeated. When the army is carried off, the king of the south will be filled with pride and will slaughter many thousands, yet he will not remain triumphant. For the king of the north will muster another army, larger than the first, and after several years he will advance with a huge army fully equipped. In those times many will rise against the king of the south. Those who are violent among your own people will rebel in fulfillment of the vision, but without success. Then the king of the north will come and build up siege ramps and will capture a fortified city. The forces of the south will be powerless to resist. Even their best troops will not have the strength to stand. The invader will do as he pleases. No one will be able to stand against him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land and will have the power to destroy it. He will determine to come with the might of his entire kingdom and will make an alliance with the king of the south. And he will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the kingdom. But his plans will not succeed or help him. Then he will turn his attention to the coastlands and will take many of them. But a commander will put an end to his insolence and will turn his insolence back on him. After this, he will turn back toward the fortresses of his own country, but will stumble and fall to be seen no more. His successor will send out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor. In a few years, however, he will be destroyed, yet not in anger or battle. You following me so far? Okay. He will be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honor of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. Then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him. Both it and a prince of the covenant will be destroyed. After coming to an agreement with him, he will act deceitfully, and with only a few people he will rise to power. When the richest provinces feel secure, he will invade them and will achieve what neither his fathers nor his forefathers did. He will distribute plunder, loot, and wealth among his followers. He will plot the overthrow of fortresses, but only for a time. With a large army, he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. The king of the south will wage war with a large and very powerful army, but he will not be able to stand because of the plots devised against him. Those who eat from the king's provisions will try to destroy him. His army will be swept away, and many will fall in battle. The two kings, with their hearts bent on evil, will sit at the same table and lie to each other, but to no avail, because an end will still come at the appointed time. The king of the north will return to his own country with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant. He will take action against it and then return to his own country. At the appointed time, he will invade the south again. But this time, the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he will lose heart. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the holy covenant. He will return and show favor to those who forsake the holy covenant. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. With flattery, he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him. Those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword or be burned or captured or plundered. When they fall, they will receive a little help, and many who are not sincere will join them. Some of the wise will stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end. For it will still come at the appointed time. The king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed. For what has been determined must take place. He will show no regard for the gods of his ancestors or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. Instead of them, he will honor a god of fortresses, a god unknown to his ancestors. He will honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god and will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people and will distribute the land at a price. At the time of the end of the king of the south, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand. He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt, with the Libyans and Cushites in submission. But reports from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch his royal tents between the seas, at the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress such as has not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, roll up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge. How many of you made it? Okay, now tell me this. Be honest with me. How many of you, at some point during that, let your mind wander? Yeah, that's right. Okay, now, this is something that just absolutely fascinates me. Jesus shows up. And by the way, I'm not blaming you for letting your mind wander. I came up with an illustration for later on in the message that maybe I'll use while I was reading that. And so, I'm telling you something. As we were talking, okay, this week, I've been reading this passage a lot. And for the past couple of weeks, I've been reading this passage a lot. I've listened to it on audiobook form because I wanted to hear what it sounded like when I just listened to it. And I've read it, and I've read commentaries on this stuff, and I'm honest with you, I love the Bible. I'm fascinated by the Bible. But as I was going through this stuff and reading the commentaries, I took many naps this week. I was working my tail off to try to understand it. I took a lot of naps, and 2 or 3. But because here's the thing, I'm not blaming you. I think this is intentionally confusing because pay attention. Jesus knows that Daniel has no relationship to any of the stuff he's telling him. There's no way Daniel could know all this stuff. And see, the bottom line is you and I think we want details. We think we want God to give us all kinds of details, about his plans for the world. And when he dumps all these details on top of us, we're like, well, I don't really, that's a pretty rock over there. I like those lights, they're kind of neat. Squirrel, something. We have this, God is giving us all these details for how the future is going to work. And we're like, well, it doesn't really matter to me. It doesn't connect. Because this is the truth, okay? This is the truth. We don't want details. We want 3 things. We want God to tell us 3 things about the future. We want to know what's in it for me, how do I get it, and how long will it take? That's what we want to know. We want to know what's in it for me, how do I get it, and how long will it take? I've been in church world for a long time. My dad was a pastor, many of you know. And there's a lot of Bible prophecy in this book, and there are a lot of people who read Bible prophecies, whether it's in Revelation or Daniel or Ezekiel or some other place. And you know what they do all the time? They dig into the prophecies so that they can figure out what's in it for me, what do I need to do, and how long will it take? And that's usually the way we approach prophecy. That's why this chapter is so refreshing to us, because there's nothing in this chapter about me. It's about that king and that king and that king and that king and his heir and his descendant and his daughter and his wife and this and that and the other thing. And this guy raised up an army and he was defeated, and so he went back home with his tail between his legs and he raised up another army and he came and it's just like, come on, history. I wasn't interested in history in school. Why are you dumping it on me now? And it's before it ever happened even, Jesus, Listen, Jesus is doing something besides satisfying Daniel. He's doing something completely different in this vision. And we have 2 clues for what he's doing. Those 2 clues are bound up in the grammar and the language of the vision. Now, I'm a grammar snob, and I will correct people's pronunciation around me. So please, if I ever do that to you, just tap me on the shoulder and say, you didn't need to do that. Because, I don't need to do that. But I'm a grammar snob because my mom was a grammar snob. My dad was a grammar snob. So I'm going to teach you a little bit of grammar, something right now, okay? And this is relevant to what's happening here. There's something called a passive voice. If any of you have taken any business training where you have to learn how to write documentation for the business, then you know that you're always told to not use the passive voice. There's the active voice and the passive voice. I'll illustrate. I'll give you an example. A passive voice says this: well, mistakes were made. An active voice says, I made a mistake. Can you tell the difference? A passive voice says, well, teacher, I just don't know what happened. The homework just got lost. An active voice says, I lost my homework. See, the passive voice is what you hear politicians say all the time. Pay attention, okay? Because passive voice is when the people involved are not responsible for the results. Or at least they're trying to make you think they're not responsible for the results. I want to show you something here. Throughout this passage, throughout this vision, the passive voice shows up time and time again. Let me show you just some of these verses. Verse 4, his empire will be broken. His empire will be uprooted and given. Verse 5, she will be handed over. Verse 20, he will be destroyed, but not in battle. Verse 21, he will be succeeded. Verse 22, an army will be swept away. A prince will be destroyed. Verse 26, an army will be swept away. 41, an army will, or they will be delivered from his hand. Verse 45, yet he will come to his end. Do you see what's going on here? Every one of these throughout this whole passage, there's something going on with the passive voice that's going on in this passage. And it's trying to let us know that even though there are all these kings, they're not responsible for what happened. See, it doesn't say one king swept away another king. It doesn't say the king destroyed the prince. It says the prince just was destroyed. None of the kings that are involved in this little story that we read, in this prophecy that Jesus gives, none of them have the right to take credit for what happens because they aren't in charge. Here's the first thing to write down. Despite all these kings, all these many kings, God's really the one in charge. Now, this actually shows up all over the place in the Bible. Whenever you see the passive voice in the Bible, it's not always that case. It's not always the case, but it's often the case that it's a passive voice to let us know that it's really God at work behind the scenes. He's the one who takes credit for it. And so just every time you see a will be delivered or something, just ask yourself this question: could that be God at work? It's not always the case, but it's often the case. And it's something to think about. But especially in this passage here, where it shows up time and time again in the context of kings, all these kings, and none of them get the credit for what goes on. God's in charge. He's the one at work behind the scenes. He's the reason all these things happen. The next clue we get is another word. It's a vocabulary. It's not grammar, it's vocabulary, and it's a word that shows up time and time and time again. It's the word time. And it gets repeated all over. In fact, let me show you some of these verses. Verse 24, it says something happened, but only for a time. Verse 27, an end will still come at the appointed time. Verse 29, at the appointed time. Verse 33, for a time they will fall. Verse 35, until the time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time. Verse 36, until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. In verse 40, at the time of the end. It's almost as if this entire vision, this entire prophecy of this wide range of history, however long it's going to take, is punctuated by alarm clocks. Okay? It's like one alarm clock after another has been set for this time, then for that time, then for this time, then for the next time. And so this king might go ahead and have some opportunity to do something, but then bring, his time is up, it's time to move on to the next phase. And then something happens, but it's only for a time, because when that alarm clock hits, it's now in a new time. And it's like all of history is punctuated by these alarm clocks that say that time is done, a new time is beginning. And of course the question is, who set the alarms? Who's the one who determines what needs to take place? Who's the one who appoints the time? And that verse right there, verse 36, there's a time of wrath that is going to be completed because something has been determined to take place. You see, the one who's in charge has a plan. Here's the next thing to write down. Despite all the chaos, God has a plan. Despite all the chaos, all the confusion, and all the turmoil, and all the politicians saying their passive voice things, God has the charge, and He has a plan. Now, that's the lesson we've been learning this whole time, right? And so this whole chapter is really just about that. You see what I did? I took all the details from chapter 11 and I just pushed them aside, and then I gave you these two snippets of meaning, that God is in charge and He has a plan. And there's a part of us that feels relief at that, that we can just take all chapter 11, just kind of sweep aside all those details, get back to this overlying theme, and it's like, okay, now it makes sense to me a little bit. But you know what? Jesus still gave all the details. Why? Why are all those details? I mean, He could have just looked at Daniel and said, Daniel, this is the last thing I'm going to say to you. I'm in charge. I got a plan. This is the last thing I'm going to say. I'm just telling you, I'm in charge. I got a plan. Don't worry about anything. He could have said that. But no, He dumps all these details on top of Daniel, who couldn't possibly have known what they were all about. Why? Let's read chapter 12, finish it up, and see what Jesus says to Daniel to conclude this whole thing. We're going to start in verse 4, a little bit of overlap there so we can connect it to what we read previously. But start in verse 4, we're going to go through verse 13. But you, Daniel, roll up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there before me stood two others, one on this bank of the river and one on the opposite bank. One of them said to the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river, "How long will it be before these astonishing things are fulfilled?" The man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river lifted his right hand and his left hand toward heaven. And I heard him swear by Him who lives forever, saying, "It will be for a time, times, and half a time. When the power of the holy people has been finally broken, all these things will be completed." I heard, but I did not understand. So I asked, "My Lord, what will the outcome of all this be?" He replied, "Go your way, Daniel, because the words are rolled up and sealed until the time of the end. Many will be purified, made spotless, and refined, but the wicked will continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand. From the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished, and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1,335 days. As for you, go your way till the end. You will rest, and then at the end of the days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance." You will rise to receive your allotted inheritance. It's like Jesus has taken all this political, historical carnage and just dumped it on the ground in front of Daniel. Kings and queens and armies and whatnot, nations, just dump it all down right in front of Daniel. There it is, lying on the ground. And then he even throws this extra piece, times, time, and half a time. And he takes that and he dumps it down there on the carnage. And then he does this other thing about 1,290 days, but no, I really meant 1,335 days. And he takes that and he dumps it on that, and he's got this whole pile of prophetic carnage and confusion and craziness. And then Jesus takes this yellow caution tape and he wraps it all the way around it, and says, "Daniel, okay, move along, nothing to see here." And it's like, what are you doing, man? You just dump all this stuff right there and then you say, "Oh, I sealed it up. I'm not going to talk." It's like right there, Jesus says at the beginning, He says, "Seal it up until the time of the end." Many are going to go here and there to increase knowledge. Yeah, Daniel's right there trying to increase his knowledge. He's like, "Come on, give me a little bit of information. I don't understand." And Jesus says, "Move along. Nothing to see here. I already wrapped it up. Just move along." It's like Jesus wants him to be confused and just get on with his life. Bingo. It's like Jesus wants him to be confused and not worry about it. In fact, Jesus gives us a couple things right there in verses 9 through 10 and verse 13 that give us actually a bullet point list of why He wants us to be totally confused and just get on with our lives. Look at it. He says this, verse 9, "Go your way, Daniel, because the words are rolled up and sealed until the time of the end." That's the first thing. The word is somehow so sure that it's going to happen even though you don't know what it means right now. Number 2, he says, many will be purified, made spotless, and refined. And that's the second thing. God's people are going to be somehow cleansed and purified through this process. Then number 3, he says, but the wicked will continue to be wicked. That's the third thing. Jesus is like, there's still going to be bad people out there. There are always bad people out there. And then the last thing is this. He says, the wicked will not understand, but those who are wise will understand. Verse 13, as for you, go your way till the end. You will rest. And then at the end of days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance. At the end of days, you will rise to find understanding. At the end of days, you will get what you've been asking for. At the end of days, you will receive your inheritance. That's the fourth thing. You see, here's the truth. Until you are brought to a place of confusion, you don't trust. See, if I know all the answers, then it's not trust. Then it's just science, research, you know? But if I get to that place of confusion, I don't know the answer here. I don't know what's going on here. The doctor comes up to you and they say, well, you've got cancer, blah, 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 chemotherapy, blah, blah, and none of the rest of it makes any sense to you. And you get another opinion from someone else, and they give you more terminology that you don't understand. And you hear all the terms, and you can go on to WebMD as much as you want, but it's not going to teach you anything. And all that stuff is confusing, and finally you have to come down to the place, am I going to let him inject me or not? Am I going to trust him to do what he says needs to be done? It's only when you come to the place of confusion that you actually have to say, I trust. And there are 4 things Jesus wants you and me to trust that he identifies to Daniel right there. And those are the 4 things that take you from this place of now all the way to the end of your life. 4 things. Here's the first one. God's word is true. God's word is true. Jesus said to Daniel, I gave you all these words. Now wrap it up, put it on a shelf, don't worry about it, but it's coming true. In the time of the end, it will come true. Well, you know what? Here's a fascinating thing. At the time Daniel sealed up these words, at the time Daniel put it all down into his book and then closed the book and then was like, I'm done with my life. At the time Daniel did that, he didn't understand what any of it meant. But you know what? We do now. As a matter of fact, we know a lot of what this meant. And the details that Jesus gives in chapter 11 will knock you on your rear, amaze you by these things I'm about to show you, hopefully. Look at this. Chapter 11, verse 2. We're told in this verse that there are 4 kings that will follow the current king. As a matter of fact, in Persia, there were 4 kings that followed Cyrus. Their names were Cambyses, Gaumata, Darius, and Xerxes. In chapter 11, verse 3, we learn of a new king that rises to power and conquers them all. And you know what? From history, we have his name. His name is Alexander the Great. In the very next verse, we find that Alexander the Great dies without any descendants. As a matter of fact, he died without any descendants. And his kingdom was divided up into 4 winds, it says in the verse. And those 4 winds are the 4 directions of his kingdom. And as a matter of fact, that's what history tells us happened. In verse 4, we find out from history that those 4 kingdoms were divided among 4 guys, Antipater, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. In verse 5, we learn that the king of the south had a commander who got stronger than him and became a king of his own kingdom. And that was Ptolemy in the south, and Seleucus, who was his commander, who became more powerful than him and took the kingdom of, actually at the time, the eastern area. But because Antipater and Lysimachus, their 2 kingdoms, sort of dissolved and weren't as significant, Seleucus was the northern kind of kingdom. And so the king of the south was Ptolemy, the king of the north was Seleucus, and actually the rest of chapter 11 reads like a history book. I'm talking, there is a 1-to-1 correspondence between what this chapter says and what actually happened in history. So much so that scholars who don't believe God knows the future, or they don't believe that God speaks to people, they actually say that this chapter was written after it all happened. because it's so accurate. One-to-one correspondence. In fact, just a couple other curious things. In verse 17, we're told about a daughter who's given in marriage to another king. We find out that it's a daughter from one of the Seleucid kings who is given to one of the Ptolemaic kings. She goes down to Egypt. Her name is Cleopatra. Cleopatra the first, not the Cleopatra with Mark Antony and that whole story. This is the first Cleopatra. She becomes the queen of Egypt eventually. And then we come to chapter 11, verse 21, and we get introduced to another guy, a guy named Antiochus. Antiochus the fourth. His name isn't given to us in the chapter, but we know his name from history. In fact, this guy was so arrogant. This guy was so stuck on himself. And he became a king, just like we're told here in the verses 21. He became a king not because he was an heir to the throne, but because he was sneaky. And because he was using flattery. He weaseled his way in and he became the king. And he was so confident in himself that he gave himself the nickname Epiphanes. And on his coins, he wrote the words Antiochus Theos Epiphanes, which literally means Antiochus, God manifest. He believed that he himself was the manifestation of God. That dude was a nutcase. But that dude fulfilled the rest of what we see in this chapter. If you look in verse 31, we get an event that happened in 168 BC. When he came into the temple and he set up a statue of Zeus and he sacrificed a pig on the altar. We talked about this just a couple weeks ago, back when we were studying chapter 8. But this Antiochus dude, he falls perfectly in line with what happened. And so in chapter 11, what you find is every one of these details that Jesus gives matches perfectly in line with what actually happened in history. Until you get to verse 36. And then it gets weird. Because see, verse 36 through 44 halfway talks about Antiochus. Half of it, it's like halfway true for what we know about Antiochus from history. It's not all true. It's only halfway true. And then we get to verse 40 to 45, you find stuff that has no relationship to history whatsoever. So you're left with two options. You're left with a decision. Option one, decide that this was all made up somehow after the fact to get, the history right. God wasn't speaking. It was made up after the fact to get the history right. But it was written before Antiochus was dead, and so they just made up the rest of the stuff, and that's why it didn't fit. Option two, it was really God's prophecy, and all of his prophecy came true all the way up to verse 36, and then it just went haywire. Because, God couldn't look that far into the future. Option three, because the rest of it is so accurate, this other stuff must also be accurate and just hasn't happened yet. And you've got a decision to make. Are you going to trust God's word and what it says, even when it's confusing? See, here's the thing. Jesus says, I'm going to dump on you all kinds of confusion. You have no idea what it means, but other people later will. And those other people will know some of what it means, but they won't know all of what it means. And as you go through history, more and more people have known more and more about this chapter, but everyone throughout that same period of history has been asked to believe it. So, even if it's confusing to you, even if there are parts of the Bible that you don't understand, even if there's a passage where Jesus says, do this, and you're like, I don't know if I want to do that, even if that shows up, will you still trust God's word? See, that's where Jesus is going with this. The second thing Jesus wants you to trust is that evil isn't dead yet. Now, this isn't hard for us to trust, but there's an aspect of it that is hard for us to trust. See, what we like to think is that as we look back through history, all the bad stuff has really already gone. We like to think that we've grown up. We like to think that we've matured enough as a people, as a nation, as a country, as a world. We like to think we've matured enough that some of this really bad stuff isn't going to happen anymore. But this passage tells us very clearly that yes, it's going to happen more. It's going to happen at least one more time. As a matter of fact, as you go through history, you see the same pattern repeated over and over again. We talked about this in Daniel chapter 7 and chapter 8. That this king, this leader who comes to power but wants more power, and then finds himself opposing God's people, and then he oppresses God's people, and then he gets the beat down from God. We've seen that happen time and time again through history. It happened with Antiochus. It happened before that. It happened with the Babylonians. It happened all throughout history. And in fact, we see it come into modern times with Hitler. And then Stalin and Lenin, guys like that, Mao in China. We see it time and time again. The question for us is, do we honestly believe we've grown out of it? Do we honestly believe that us here in the United States of America are immune from it? Or if we pay attention to what the Bible teaches us, we must believe that at least one more guy is going to come. And that one more guy is going to oppress God's people, something fierce. And those people will have to make a decision. Do I walk into the fire and trust God? Or do I follow the easy path and do whatever this leader tells me to do? At least one more time. If evil isn't dead yet, and if verses 36 through 40 haven't happened yet, it's got to happen at least one more time. Are you ready for that time? The third thing Jesus wants us to learn, and he wants us to trust him in, is this, that fire, this fire we've been talking about that we need to walk into, this fire of testing and trial that's going to happen at least one more time when that leader shows up, fires refine. Fires purify. Fires refine God's people. Over and over in the passage that we've read today, it talks about how these tragedies happen not because God's people are being punished. You see, Daniel was taken into Babylon because God was punishing the people of Israel. But after that punishment, the rest of this stuff is just bad people being bad people. Jesus doesn't say, you're going to be punished. He says it's just bad people doing bad things. And God's people get caught in the crosshairs. But in the crosshairs, when the fire comes, that's when you're tested. And some of us get refined and come out purified. And some of us fall and don't make it. These fires refine us. And the fourth thing Jesus wants us to trust is that victory is coming. One of these days, that final leader will show up, and he'll do his thing. And one of these days, an alarm will go off, and his time will be up. And when that happens, the real king will come and set up his kingdom and eliminate evil and raise his people to victory. And this is not just a New Testament thought. Because right here in the book of Daniel, 500 years before Jesus, we see the first ever depiction of resurrection and heaven and hell in the Bible. Jesus comes to Daniel. He dumps on him all kinds of confusion and then ends it all with the most amazing thing that has happened to anyone in the Old Testament. When he reveals to them the ultimate end of days, you will be raised from the dead. And those who are in my family, those who have been refined by the fire, those who have passed through, made it, have endured to the end, they will be raised to life. Their names will be found in the book, and they will enter into the kingdom of victory with him. But those whose names are not in the book, those who are living today without that fire, and they are refusing to be refined and to follow God and to choose his path for their lives, those people will be raised up to judgment. And this shows up in Daniel 500 years before the New Testament. Daniel was given an amazing gift of insight into this far future event. But you and I are closer to it than was he. And the question for us is, are we in that book? Is our name in that book? Have I chosen the path of God despite the fire? Or am I walking the path of me? And that's where we end the book. Daniel is confused. And Jesus says to him very simply, trust these things. Get on with your life. And someday you'll receive your reward. Listen, when you face any fire of any kind, any trial of any kind, you need to remember that God's word is still true. That evil isn't dead yet. That fire is just for refinement. That victory is coming, and it's all because God is in charge and He has a plan for His people. I hope these words are encouraging to you. But I also hope that if any of you today are not sure that your name is in that book, that you have chosen the path of following God, that you would deal with it today, that you would say in your heart to God, I'm ready now. Take my life, lead me for the rest of my life. I give you me. I don't even know what it's all about, but I'm going to walk this path. I'm going to pursue this knowledge of what does it mean for me to step into that fire. I encourage you, put something down on your card, talk to me, talk to Billy, talk to someone else that you can just grab onto and say, tell me about this thing. How do I make sure that I know that I know? But right now, I want to give you just some time, you and God. Take that card out of wherever you've put it and jot some thoughts down on the back side of it and mark some things on the front of it and say, right here, God, would you speak to me? What is He saying into your heart? Let me pray for you. Thank you for listening to this message from Lafayette Community Church. We believe that God has a full and fulfilling life in store for you, and we want to help you live it. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, Pastor Jeff, through the web form at LafayetteCommunityChurch.com. And as always, I encourage you to plug into a solid, God-honoring community wherever you may be. Life is a journey, and no one should ever walk alone.